Minneapolis, June 2017. Alec Smith is 26 years old, 3 weeks past the day he aged off his mother's health insurance, and doing the math on his kitchen table. A restaurant manager earning about $35,000 a year, he's looking at an insurance plan that costs $450 a month, with a $7,600 deductible, and insulin that costs roughly $1,300 a month without coverage. Payday is June 30th. His insulin is not going to last that long, so he does what a documented number of people with type 1 diabetes have done. When the vial runs low and the next paycheck hasn't landed, he stretches it. He rations doses to make the supply reach payday. On June 27th, 3 days short, he is found dead of diabetic ketoacidosis, his body poisoned by the exact deficiency insulin exists to correct. Minnesota later named a law after him, the Alec Smith Insulin Affordability Act, passed in 2020, creating an emergency insulin access program, so the next 26-year-old aging off a parent's coverage doesn't have to do the same math. Here is what makes Alec Smith's death stranger than an ordinary story about expensive medicine. Insulin was never supposed to be able to do this. The 3 scientists who isolated it didn't patent it to get rich. They patented it, then gave it away for $1 each, specifically so that no company could ever corner the market and price someone like Alec Smith out of staying alive. So the question isn't just why insulin got expensive, it's how a drug engineered from the start to be un-monopolizable became one of the most concentrated, most expensive, most rationed medicines in America, and whether anyone actually broke the promise those 3 scientists made in 1923, or whether something stranger happened before 1921, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes in a child was close to a death sentence. Most had well under a year to live, dying from diabetic coma as their bodies, unable to process sugar, poisoned themselves from the inside. The best treatment medicine had was starvation. Physician Frederick Madison Allen prescribed diets as low as 400 to 600 calories a day, heavy in fat and protein, stripped of carbohydrate, to starve off the glucose that was killing his patients. It worked in the narrow sense that it bought time. Some patients lived measurably longer on it. It also killed some of them outright, of literal starvation. Both things are true. The Allen diet was simultaneously the best medicine had to offer and a regimen that starved people to death, slightly more slowly than their disease would have. In practice, that meant doctors put a child, already wasting from undiagnosed diabetes, on a diet with less food than a famine ration, hoping that starving slower would buy enough time for anything to be discovered. That was the standard of care. Doctors weren't failing their patients, they were doing the only thing that measurably worked, and it still amounted to managed starvation. Then, at the University of Toronto in 1921, 4 people changed that. Not one hero, 4, with 4 different jobs. Frederick Banting had the idea for the extraction method. His assistant Charles Best ran the experiments alongside him. John McLeod, head of physiology, supplied the lab and the resources, and biochemist James Collip did the part that actually made the discovery usable. He purified the raw extract into something safe enough to inject into a human being. That human being was 14-year-old Leonard Thompson, admitted to Toronto General Hospital in December 1921, already near death, kept alive that long only by the same starvation diet described above. On January 11, 1922, he received Banting and Best's first unpurified batch. It caused an allergic reaction. 12 days later, on January 23rd, he received Collip's purified extract. It worked. Leonard Thompson, who should have died within the year, lived another 13 to age 27. Banting and Best expected their first injection to be the breakthrough. Instead, it made a dying boy sicker. The real turning point came 12 days later, from the purification work of the chemist whose name would almost be left off the prize entirely. Here's the strange part. When the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine came in 1923, it went to only 2 of the 4 names, Banting and McLeod. Best and Collip, whose work mattered just as much, got nothing. Banting was reportedly furious enough that he split his own prize money with Best. McLeod did the same with Collip, The discovery of the drug that would save millions of lives couldn't even get its own credit distributed cleanly. Discovery is one problem. What you do with the patent is another, and this is where Banting, Best, and Collip made the decision that this whole story turns on. In 1922 and 1923, the three of them signed over their insulin patent rights to the University of Toronto's Board of Governors for $1 each. Not a token opening bid, the actual final price. They completed the paperwork through January 1923, and the U.S. Patent Office formally granted patent number 1,469,994 that October. Banting is widely quoted as saying, "Insulin belonged to the world, not to him." No one has produced a verified transcript of him saying it, but every account of his decision points the same direction. He and his co-inventors could have licensed insulin exclusively to a single company and become extraordinarily rich. They chose deliberately not to. The reasoning was explicit. Keep any one company from monopolizing the supply of a medicine people would need for the rest of their lives. Toronto's Board of Governors accepted the assignment on those terms. A public university, not a company, holding the rights on behalf of a wider licensing plan. And there's a detail buried in the patent's fine print that matters enormously later. It covered only the original method, extracting insulin from crushed animal pancreas, not the molecule itself, and not any future way of making it. Nobody in 1923 could have anticipated that this narrow scope would matter 60 years later. Hold on to that. This wasn't a naive decision, made without understanding what a patent was worth. Banting, Best, and Collip knew exactly what they were giving up. Sole control of the only known treatment for a disease that, until months earlier, had been a death sentence. They gave it up anyway. For a while, the plan worked exactly as designed. On May 30, 1922, the University of Toronto signed a deal with Eli Lilly, a one-year exclusive license to manufacture in the U.S., in exchange for Lilly sharing its production knowledge back with Toronto. Lilly supplied insulin free during that initial testing period, then at cost. Then, once that year ended, Toronto's Insulin Committee did exactly what the $1 sale was designed to allow. It started licensing other manufacturers, non-exclusively, anyone who could meet the standard. By 1923, a German lab was producing insulin under a Toronto license. Production started in Denmark and Austria that same year, and in Hungary, Australia, and Argentina the year after. 6 new countries manufacturing insulin within 24 months of the discovery, exactly the outcome the $1 patent sale was built to produce. Denmark's version of that story is the one that matters most for where this is going. A company called Nordisk started making licensed insulin there in 1923. 2 years later, 2 brothers who'd worked at Nordisk, Harold and Thorvald Pedersen, split off and founded their own competitor, Novo. Competing Danish insulin companies born directly out of a deliberately non-exclusive license. Decades later, in 1989, those 2 rivals would merge into a single company, Novo Nordisk, one name from what had started, by design as 2 competitors instead of one. And competition did what competition is supposed to do. Eli Lilly cut its U.S. price 10 separate times between 1923 and 1936. In Canada, insulin fell from 65 cents per 100 units in 1926 to 32 cents by 1935. Broadly, insulin that cost around $1 per 100 units in the early 1920s was running under 20 cents by the 1940s. A medicine that could have been priced as a monopoly instead got cheaper, decade after decade, because the men who discovered it structured the license so that nobody could corner it. Somewhere between Toronto, Indianapolis, and Copenhagen, competition kept doing its job on the price. For 60 years, the $1 patent sale did exactly what it was designed to do. Then, in the early 1980s, the entire scientific basis of insulin changed, and with it, so did the patent question the 1923 gift had settled. Eli Lilly licensed a new kind of technology from the biotech startup Genentech, bacteria genetically engineered to manufacture human insulin directly, rather than insulin extracted from the pancreases of pigs and cows. Lilly filed for FDA approval of the resulting drug, Humulin, on May 14, 1982. The FDA approved it on October 28, about 5 months later, against an average review time at the time of roughly 30 months. It was the first genetically engineered pharmaceutical product ever approved for sale in the United States, and the first real departure from animal-derived insulin since the 1920s. 60 years earlier, insulin had come from grinding up slaughterhouse pancreases by the barrel. Now it came from vats of genetically modified bacteria, engineered to behave like microscopic insulin factories. Same molecule, same job in the body, a completely different invention under patent law. Here's why this matters to the patent story. Recombinant human insulin was a genuinely new invention, a new organism, a new manufacturing process, a molecule identical to human insulin, but made a completely different way. Remember what the 1923 patent covered: only the old animal extraction process. It legally had nothing to say about bacteria engineered to make insulin in a vat. That patent hadn't been broken or dodged. It simply didn't reach this far. A new, patentable technology had walked back through a door the 1923 gift never covered in the first place. Once insulin could be patented again, the industry didn't need to break any rules. To extend that exclusivity for decades, it just needed to get creative about what exactly counted as the invention. A 2023 study in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS Medicine tracked every FDA-approved insulin product from 1986 through 2019. It found 454 patents filed before approval across 56 different products, plus another 107 added to the Orange Book listing after approval. But most of those 87 were for patents actually filed before approval and simply entered into the listing later. Only 20 were patents filed after the drug was already on the market. In the study's earliest years, the median product carried 0 patents. By its final stretch, 2008 to 2019, that median had climbed to 17. Follow-on patents extended 9 products' protection by a median of 6 additional years. And of the 33 products sold as a drug and device combination, the very last patent to expire was a patent on the injector pen, not the drug inside it. For 22 of them, 67%. Those device patents extended market protection by a median of 5.2 more years. Of those 22 last to expire device patents, 17, 77%, didn't mention insulin anywhere in their claims at all. Sit with that last number for a second. Patents on a pen mechanism, a spring, a dial, that never once referenced the drug it injects, being used to block competitors from selling that drug. That's not a loophole discovered by accident. That's the mechanism doing exactly what it was drafted to do. Why does listing a patent in a government database matter this much? Because of what it triggers. Once a patent is listed in the FDA's Orange Book, a challenger has to certify that its product doesn't infringe it, a so-called paragraph IV certification, and if the patent holder sues over that certification within 45 days, an automatic 30-month stay kicks in while the courts sort it out. No separate court order required. Win or lose the underlying case. The delay itself functions as protection. Sanofi listed a patent on its SoloStar insulin pen's drive mechanism in the Orange Book, when Mylan and Merck each filed applications in 2016 and 2017 to sell competing insulin glargine pens, years before insulin even had a biosimilar approval pathway. Both certified against that patent, and Sanofi sued inside the window, triggering the stay. In 2020, the First Circuit Court of Appeals reportedly found that Sanofi had listed the patent improperly. By the time that ruling came down, the delay it triggered had already done its work. The 30 months don't refund themselves once a listing is found improper after the fact. The results from the same PLOS Medicine study, across 33 years, only 5 follow-on insulin products were approved in the entire U.S. market, across just 3 insulin lines. Lilly's Basaglar was approved 17.3 years before Sanofi's original Lantus's own last patent finally expired. Sanofi's follow-on to Lilly's Humalog, called Admelog, was approved just 6.7 years before Humalog's last patent expired. Baxter's Mixredlin, a ready-to-use IV formulation of human insulin, followed in 2019. Median total market protection across all the insulin products in the study, 16 years from approval. 17.6 years when counting a product's full line of formulations under one application. The non-exclusive license that once let a company launch within a year of the original patent had, by the 2010s, given way to a system where 16 years was normal. By the 2010s, the effect of decades of device patent extensions had a name: consolidation. Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, the big three, came to control more than 90% of the global insulin market by value. In the United States specifically, those same three companies produce almost the entire domestic supply. Of the wave of manufacturers licensed in that first non-exclusive rush of the 1920s, only the Danish lineage, Nordisk and Novo, merged since 1989 into Novo Nordisk, is still standing among the dominant players. The German, Austrian, Hungarian, and Argentine producers from that same wave are not among today's three names. 90 years of mergers and patent-driven attrition narrowed a genuinely global, multi-manufacturer market down to three names. That's not the whole story on its own, though. A market controlled by three firms isn't automatically a market where people die rationing their medicine. What turned concentration into a body count was the price structure the evergreen patents protected, and what that price structure did to people without deep insurance coverage. A study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in October 2022, the first national estimate of its kind, found that roughly 1.3 million American adults with diabetes, 16.5% of all U.S. adult insulin users, had rationed their doses due to cost in the previous year. Break it down by insurance status and the pattern gets sharper. 29.2% of uninsured insulin users rationed, 1,008.8% of the privately insured, even 13.5% of people on Medicare. The study put typical insulin costs at around $1,000 a month. Having insurance didn't come close to solving the problem either. It just lowered the odds. Even inside the Medicare system, built specifically to cover people who need ongoing prescriptions, more than 1 in 8 people were still stretching a life-sustaining drug to make it last. Take a breath before the next part, because these aren't percentages anymore. They're names. Shane Patrick Boyle, 48, Arkansas, died March 18, 2017, days after a GoFundMe campaign to cover his insulin fell $50 short. Antavia Lee Worsham, 22, Ohio, died April 26, 2017, after aging off state insurance coverage at 18 and resorting to rationing and borrowing insulin from others. Jesse James Lutkin, 32, Iowa, died February 7, 2018, after losing his job and being unable to afford insulin out of pocket. And Alec Smith, whose story opened this video. Right. Care Alliance's own tally lists at least 14 named American deaths tied to insulin rationing. Boyle, Worsham, Lutkin, and Smith are simply the 4 whose cases are the most thoroughly documented in independent reporting, not the only ones. So, back to Alec Smith's kitchen table, June 2017, doing the math on a bill he can't pay. None of what killed him traces to a single villain, not to Banting, Best, and Collip. They gave the patent away for $1 specifically to prevent this. Not to biotech, which simply invented a molecule the 1923 patent never covered. Not to any one company, but to 3, and to a patent and exclusivity system that let pen mechanisms stand in for the drug itself, and to an insurance and pricing structure downstream of all of it that left a 26-year-old doing arithmetic between 2 paychecks. 90+% market concentration, a 16-year median of patent protection, and 1.3 million people rationing doses, 3 separate, independently documented mechanisms that together produced one outcome. Take any one of them away, and the story would look different. None of them alone explains it. There was no single meeting where someone decided insulin should become unaffordable. No memo, no plan. Just a century of individually defensible decisions, compounding. And it isn't only an American story right now. Worldwide, an estimated 93 million people in low and middle-income countries need insulin. Only about 35 million of them get it. A gap driven mostly by undiagnosed diabetes and strained health systems. Not price alone, though the same 3 companies that dominate the U.S. market also supply roughly 83% of the insulin sold across those countries. Even where the per-day price of insulin is low by American standards, supply chains and local incomes still keep tens of millions of people from a drug that has existed, and existed cheaply, for a century. That gap is projected to widen before it narrows. The number of people actually receiving insulin in low- and middle-income countries is projected to more than double, from about 35 million in 2025 to 76 million by 2035. But even then, tens of millions are projected to still go without, because need is projected to keep growing too, toward roughly 105 to 106 million people by that same year. 100 years ago, 3 scientists looked at a patent that could have made them rich, and signed it away for $1 each, so that a drug that keeps people alive could never belong to just one company. A century later, 3 companies control it anyway. Not because anyone broke that promise, but because the promise was written for a world that hadn't invented recombinant DNA, injector pens, or a health insurance system that lets a 26-year-old age off his mother's coverage 3 weeks before his insulin runs out. Leonard Thompson, the first patient ever saved by insulin, got 13 extra years no one expected him to have. Alec Smith, a century later, didn't get the 3 weeks he needed to reach his next paycheck. Between those 2 facts sits the entire history of this drug, a molecule that hasn't changed what it does in the human body since 1922, wrapped in a patent and pricing system that changed almost everything else. Insulin was never supposed to be a story about scarcity. It was designed, on paper, to be the opposite. That's what makes it worth telling. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want more stories about the objects, systems, and hidden forces that built the modern world, subscribe to the channel. The next story is already waiting. See you in the next video.